Hello everybody, and welcome to the Music of Java. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Sean Hayward, and I'm a performer and researcher specializing in the music of Java. Now, as you might have noticed, I am not Javanese. I'm originally from Ventura, California, but I've been living off and on in Indonesia for about the last 5 years. And at the moment, I'm coming to you from the house of Pak Joko Waluyo, who some of you may have already met, in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So, I'm going to jump right in. For those of you who have taken gamelan courses before, some of this might be a little bit of review, so please bear with me. In this course, we're going to be going over a lot of things, but for this first day, I want to just kind of introduce the instruments, and we're going to talk a little bit about, what is gamelan and how does it work. Today is going to be a lot of information, and it's going to move pretty quickly. So if you don't catch anything right away, don't worry. It's all going to come up again as we're actually learning how to play this music. But today we're just going to be kind of going over some of the basics. So first of all, what is gamelan? Gamelan is one of the many traditional musics from Indonesia. Gamelan specifically is found mostly on the islands of Java and Bali. There's a lot of different styles, but the style that we are going to be covering is the classical Central Javanese Gamelan style. So where does this come from? This is a very old classical music. We have evidence of it, the earliest evidence going all the way back to the 7th century. And it mostly developed in the classical courts of Yogyakarta, also known as Jogja, and Surakarta, also known as Solo. Basically, the word gamelan, it can refer to a whole collection of instruments, like this is a gamelan behind me. It can refer to a group of musicians, as in I play with a gamelan, or it can refer to the music itself, like I love listening to gamelan, something like that. The word actually comes from the Sanskrit word gamel, which really just means hammer. And why is that? For maybe obvious reasons, but most of the instruments of the gamelan, the most well-known, are actually struck metallophones, meaning they have keys that are made out of metal, in this case bronze, and they are played with mallets. There are other instruments as well, including drums, bowed fiddles, flutes, plucked zithers, etc. And we're going to get to all of that later. But for right now, I just want to introduce the instruments to you, kind of one by one, in a kind of categorical way. And then we'll jump right into some learning how to read the notation and actually follow along with some pieces of Javanese gamelan. I want to thank you all again so much for joining this course. I'm really excited to share this music with you. In my humble opinion, it is one of the most beautiful and complex forms of music ever created by humans, and I'm really happy to be able to work with you on it. I wish we could all be together so that we could play this music which really comes to life as an ensemble, but in the current situation we are going to make the best of it. We are going to do what we can, and I hope to make this a really wonderful course that you can get a lot out of. So thank you again all so much for joining me, and feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have any more specific questions or anything like that. Okay, so I promise for future lectures we're not going to be using PowerPoint presentations too often, but just for this introductory one, while we're going over some of these more theoretical things, I'll be using this a little bit. So first of all, a little bit of review. What is gamelan? Here you have some of the information that we talked about before. And just so you know exactly where it is that we're talking about, Java, the island of Java, is one of the islands in the Indonesian archipelago. So in the western part of the Indonesian archipelago, directly in between the islands of Sumatra and Bali. So it can be found all over the place in Java, but the main cultural centers that I was talking about before are right here in Central Java, in Yogyakarta and in Surakarta, right here. In Javanese gamelan, we have two main scales that are used. The first is a 5-tone scale called slendro. The second is a 7-tone scale called pelog. So for every instrument that I'm going to show you, there are actually two complete instruments. one is tuned in slendro, and one is tuned in pelog. Aside from these scales, all Javanese instruments are generally categorized into three separate groups. The first category that we're going to talk about is colotomic instruments. Javanese gamelan is generally in cycles, meaning there is a single melody or pattern or form that repeats over and over and over again, or a series of these different cycles. Colotomic instruments serve the function of marking where you are, of noting the exact location within that particular cycle. So we're going to look at a few of these different instruments. The first that I'm going to show you is ketot and kempiang. Ketot and kempiang are these two small single note instruments right here. Kempiang is the higher pitched one, and ketot is the lower one. The next instrument is called khendang. Khendang are all of these large kettle gongs that are placed around me. Now, oftentimes, if there aren't enough people, ketot, kempiang, and khendang will actually all be played by a single person. For most pieces, they don't have to play too quickly, so it's possible to do just as one person. But if you have enough people, you'll have one player for ketot kempiang and one player for khendang. The next colotomic instruments that we have are all of these hanging gongs around me. The smaller gongs are referred to as kempul. And finally, the most important instrument is the large gong, also just called gong, or sometimes called gong besar or gong ageng, which just means big gong. This instrument marks both the start and the end of every cycle. The next category of instruments are called balungan instruments. Balungan literally means skeleton. So these instruments are responsible for playing the skeletal version of the melody, or the most basic version of the melody. The instruments in front of me and all around me are called saron. There are three different octaves of saron. The highest octave over here is called saron peking or saron panerus. The middle octave is called saron barong, and the lowest octave is called saron demung. The final instrument in the balungan category is this instrument called slentum. Slentum has suspended keys and similarly plays the balungan, the skeletal outline of the melody. The third category of instruments are called elaborating or flowering instruments. Just like their name kind of implies, these take that basic melody and they play complex elaborations on that melody. Now, these elaborations are different for every instrument, and they're usually based on what's more comfortable or idiomatic for that instrument in particular. These ones next to me are called bonang. There are two different octaves for this instrument. The lower octave is called bonang barong, and the higher octave behind me, these smaller instruments, are called bonang panerus. Again, just like for all of the other instruments, there are two scales. That's why we have two bonang barong and two bonang panerus, one for pelog and one for slendro. The next instrument in the flowering category is called gender. These are also suspended key instruments, and just like the bonang before, there are two octaves. The lower octave is called gender barong, and the upper octave is called gender panerus. Additionally, in the flowering instruments category, we have the two-string spike fiddle called rebab, here to my left, and we have the bamboo flute called suling to my right. Suling is actually one of the instruments that we're going to be able to work on a little bit during the course of this class. Finally, in the flowering instruments category, we have the wooden xylophone, also called gambang. Additionally, there is a box zither, a little pluck string instrument called sitra that is often used, but unfortunately I don't have one here, so I'll show you a picture in just a moment. Aside from that, the other instrument, or not instrument, depending how you think of it, that works as a flowering instrument in the gamelan ensemble is actually the human voice. So the human voice in Javanese gamelan is divided into two different categories. You have choir vocals, which can either be performed completely by men or men and women, and those are called gerong. Additionally, you have the soloistic female voice, which is called sinden. The final instrument that we need to talk about is the khendang, or drum. Now, this instrument doesn't really fit perfectly into any of those three categories. In some ways, it functions as a colotomic instrument, marking the cycle, and in other ways, it can function as a flowering instrument. When gamelan is played together with dance or with shadow puppetry, then there's a lot of interaction between the drum playing and the puppeteer, or the drum playing and the dance, respectively. Now, within the khendang, there are three different drums in Central Javanese style that are commonly used. The largest drum is called khendang gede. The smallest is khendang ketipong, and the medium-sized drum is called khendang ciblon. The most important thing about the khendang is that the khendang player is the one who's controlling the tempo. So they really form the glue of the entire ensemble. Everyone has to listen to the drum to know when to speed up and when to slow down. So, just to review quickly, those three categories of instruments we were talking about, we have here the colotomic instruments. From left to right, we have the gong, the kempul, or the smaller sized gongs, the khenong, and finally the kempiang and ketok. These instruments mark the important points of a cycle, and by doing so, they mark out the form of the piece. In the next category, we have the balungan instruments. On the left here, we have the saron, which are from high to low. We have peking, saron barong, and saron demong. Following that, we have the slentum. These instruments play a skeletal melody for the piece, providing a rough outline. So this is a really stripped down melody. Finally, we have the flowering or elaborating instruments. So from left to right here on this page, we have bonang, which is bonang barong for the lower pitch, bonang panerus for the higher pitch. In the middle, we have suling, the bamboo flute. On the right, we have gender. The lower pitched one is called barong, and the higher pitched one, again, is called panerus. So these instruments essentially take a variety of patterns to fill out the skeletal melody. So they are playing elaborations on the melody of the composition. Next up here, we have the sitra, which I spoke about earlier. We didn't have any in the room at that time, which is a plucked zither played with the thumbs of both hands. Then you have the rebab, a two-string bowed spike fiddle. And then you have gambang, the wooden xylophone, and the voice, the female vocal soloist, or the gerong, which is typically a male vocal choir. And finally, the last instruments we went over were khendang. These are the drums. They are in charge of guiding the tempo and all the tempo transitions. Typically, for Central Javanese Gamelan, we have 3 different drums that are used. The largest, khendang gede, the smallest, ketipung, and the medium drum called ciblon. And in some ways, they mark out the form, acting as a colotomic instrument. In some ways, they fill in some more detailed playing, and they act as a flowering instrument.